Today we're going to talk about the Steam Deck and some interesting similarities between the Atari VCS and some other stuff, our opinions. This is the Retrospection Podcast. All right, so to start off, I figured we would talk about some specs, unless you have some intro thoughts that you wanted to...
Nope, let's jump right in.
Okay. So the Steam Deck is a handheld gaming device. It's running Linux, Arch Linux as its platform, or its operating system. And it's basically built by Valve to facilitate gaming, and basically only gaming, but you can do other things with it. The processor, I don't think it's as important for us to go over like gigahertz and everything, but it's running RDNA 2, which is the same architecture as the Xbox Series S and X and the PlayStation 5. So that's pretty cool.
Up to par.
The RAM is 16 gigs LPDDR5, which is a little bit, I'd say, advanced for right now. Wouldn't you think so?
Yeah, like
Linus Tech Tips had brought that up, that it seemed like a step forward, but it almost seemed a bit more like future-proofing in a way.
Yeah, especially where it's running Linux. Like anything running Windows, especially Windows 10. Like Windows 10, if you have 4 gigs of RAM, you're probably hurting with, and so it requires more than even Linux does.
Yeah, and the good thing about it, it's running Linux and it has 16 gigs, but that is also somewhat shared with the GPU because it's an integrated GPU on the RDNA 2 processor.
See, when you look at it like that, it's not as bad because, I mean, you could easily get like, and I don't know how the integration works exactly, but if I have a graphics card, like it's nice to have 8 gigs of RAM just on the graphics card.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about it is that it can
balance,
flip and flop in any direction. Yeah.
So that makes a little more sense with the 16 gigs if a good chunk of that can be graphics RAM.
Oh yeah. Other than that, the storage is an M.2 slot. It says here socketed 2230 M.2, which is a tiny little, basically square-shaped chip.
It's a small one, so it makes it a little harder or a little more expensive to get a bigger size. It's harder to find, at least when I looked a couple months ago, harder to find a bigger size than like 512 gig.
Yeah, it's
and it's more expensive than if it were like a bigger M.2 size.
A company did just release a 2 terabyte card, which is cool, but I can't begin to tell you what the price is. I don't remember. But it's pretty expensive for sure.
Right. And I'd say that it was quickly becoming affordable if it wasn't for the chip shortages and possible, war in Taiwan or
Taiwan.
There's nothing there yet, but there's a chance.
Well, I know that
China takes over.
A lot of what was it called? Neon is used to power the lasers that are used to make chips. I don't know the exact process, but that's you can tell I'm a simp for Linus Tech Tips because that's where most of this information comes from for me. But that's what they were talking about. So I know chips are going to be even harder because most of the neon we get is from Ukraine. So
yeah.
Woo!
I don't even know what sort of chips are in those hard drives or if they have anything to do with Taiwan. I just know Taiwan has a lot of our chipset stuff. But
continuing on, other than the hardware specs inside the machine. On the outside, we've got your typical Xbox controller setup. So you got, I'm going to call them Start Select because I don't care to learn what the new names are.
Right.
We got Start Select, 2 joysticks, D-pad, ABXY, and then L1, L2, R1, R2. And then on the back of the Steam Deck, you've got the paddles. Is that what they call them? There's 4 paddles back there. The Steam controller only had 2, and those 2 were very useful. I use the Steam Deck controller, or the Steam controller, every time I play. And yeah.
That's the thing, the difference between this and, say, its biggest competitors, like the GPD Win, is that the GPD Win is still trying to be like also your little laptop, where this just isn't at all. That's what we're using here.
Right there, if you're watching the video.
But this isn't at all. It doesn't have a keyboard, and it doesn't natively boot into like a operating system.
Yeah, it's basically, if you were to turn on the Switch, it goes to the home screen. So
goes to their Steam home.
Yeah. Along with all those common controls, we have 2 touchpads, one on each side that you can access with your thumbs. And those are also on the Steam controller, and they're excellent for using a mouse in-game or just having any sort of precise movement. And there's also gyroscopes inside. So, really cool. It's got, I believe it's a 7-inch display. It's 1280 by 800 pixels. So it's a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. Also, same as this GPD WinMax laptop here.
The ratio.
Yeah. The screen on this laptop is an inch bigger, but it only goes up to a refresh rate of 60 hertz. Makes sense. It's a handheld. We're not playing competitive Counter-Strike. We don't need higher than that.
Yeah, I think that's plenty for a handheld.
Higher frame rate also horribly affects battery life, so even if your display can't use it, keep that in mind. If you get the Steam Deck, don't play with frame rates higher than 60 because it's not going to do you any good. It's only going to do you bad. And it's got Bluetooth 5.0, your Wi-Fi. I don't know what generation, but I'm assuming it's fine. Nobody's complained about it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It comes with a 45-watt charger. There's nothing else. Like UHS 1 supported SD and SD card, I mean. And yeah, that's basically the specs of this machine.
The battery life is going to be wholly reliant on the game you're playing and what settings you have that game on, probably.
Yeah. They do have a lot of tools in SteamOS that help you with battery life outside of the game's settings.
Right.
And I think that's where I would actually manage that the most. Rather than going into the game's menus all the time, you can just go into Steam's little quick menu they have with the Steam button. So, is there anything else you want to mention about any specs? Anything that interests you?
I don't think so.
Okay. So we did an episode of our podcast. It was the very first thing we recorded other than an iPhone parody. In 2018, we did a video about the Atari VCS when it was coming out. When they had announced it, I think there was a good amount of information out. And so we did a video about it, and we were talking, and I think there's some pretty funny things that we could kind of springboard off of that were in that video. The first thing is the fact that the Atari VCS ships with Linux. And at the time, we were fairly negative about that because Linux was, and still in a way is, very difficult to get games to play on. What I found interesting listening to that video, I looked at when it was published. What's the month before August? July? June, July, August. Yeah, July. So we published that video in July. And then a month later, Valve starts working on Proton. The first version of Proton released literally a month after that video. So before that point, there wasn't a totally reliable way to try and launch Windows games. It was all dependent on Linux native stuff. And that was our biggest gripe, is because no developers want to support Linux because the player base is so small.
Right.
So that was pretty funny, because immediately after that, Valve's like, hey, we should probably work on this cool project to get Windows games running on Linux.
Proton, for anyone who doesn't know, basically it uses, my understanding is it uses some witchcraft to get Windows games
Couple spells thrown in there.
To get Windows games to run on Linux. I have no idea.
It's basically a compatibility layer. It's based off of Wine, which is a program that's been around for a long time, where you can boot simple Windows programs, and it's always been very shaky. It's not the most reliable method for this kind of thing, but Valve has put in a ton of effort since 2018. So it's been 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. It's been 4 years now into making the majority of popular games run using this compatibility layer. And they've been updating it over the past 4 years slowly to support more things that are Windows only. And so it's kind of neat.
The fact is, they pretty much had no choice but to create this if they wanted this type of product. When they launched, what was it? Steam OS, Steambox?
Steam Machine. Oh, yeah.
It seems like their goal for that and for this was to kind of say, hey, let's take the PC market and make it console market friendly as far as fan base, user base, make it really easy to use, to understand. And I think with the Steambox, it just flopped because of that compatibility, where their best bet was to say, hey, developers, please make your games for Linux, make them work for Linux, compile them for Linux.
Yeah.
They did it with their own games, but they couldn't force anyone else to do it.
I think it's interesting because it really looks like Valve has learned from their mistakes. They have probably learned the painful lesson that developers just were not enticed by the Steam Machine and the prospect of developing for Linux. And I don't know how difficult of a process it is to port something from Windows to Linux, but I do know that any extra work that is needed to make that process or make that result happen, developers don't want to take that because, again, the Linux user base was so small. And so when Valve started Proton, I think it was their way to kind of reach in the other direction and be like, hey, developers, we're working to make your games playable on Linux. And so they've taken most of the steps in the direction towards the developers, and I think at this point they're hoping the developers will take just a couple steps in their direction to meet not exactly in the middle.
Right, and the chances of that are a lot higher now that this thing's probably going to be pretty popular. Well, it already is. I mean, It's already pretty popular, but like that's the thing Valve, I think, learned, is that a lot of companies are mostly just profit-based. And so if there's not that profit incentive for user base, there's no way it's going to happen. And Valve, as much as I can gripe about their company for the last 20 years, like, it seems like for the most part, they kind of do what their employees want to do, or what they find interesting or cool. They're not all like, what's going to make us the most money the fastest way possible.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's been part of their downfall, I think. It's part of the reason I think that they have so many undeveloped games, is because there's nothing there to say, we got to get this done in this timeline and to make this money because of this. And so things just don't happen there.
It's like a double-edged sword, because when Valve gets passionate about a project, and I think as the Steam Deck is right now, it's a great example of that. When Valve gets passionate about a project, they make some really good stuff. The last thing I recall them being super passionate about is Portal 2. Portal 2 was amazing. People loved it. The story was great. It was funny. The puzzles were amazing. The game looked great. Still looks great, even though it's like a decade old now. Like, it's like the flip-floppiness of Valve is like they get super passionate and make excellent stuff, but then like they fall off of it after a while because people's interests change. It's just like having hobbies as an individual. So,
right. But I think Valve maybe hoped that companies, or maybe they didn't realize companies just weren't going to put in very much work unless the profit margin was a lot bigger. And so they had to come that 80 to 90% of the way instead of meeting halfway or whatever it was.
Yeah, another addition to that, to the steps that Valve's taking in the developer's direction, there are so many cool APIs for the Steam Deck that developers can easily patch into to make their games just that much simpler and fluent with the Steam Deck. There are APIs to to have a game look at the Steam Deck and be like, we're playing on the Steam Deck. Automatic graphics have been chosen just for the Steam Deck, whatever the developers decided works well. And then, text will be bigger because the screen is small, just those kinds of things. And it really isn't too much work for the developer at that point because Steam's already developed these APIs that they can just patch into.
Right, and APIs are fantastic to use as a developer.
One thing I kind of wanted to go into, it's pretty obvious comparison given the internet, mostly like Twitter and Reddit, how divisive they all are. Like, we need to compare this to the Switch. And we were just talking about this before we started recording, about how our perception of Nintendo has changed slowly over time. The past 4 years since we first did that recording about the VCS, our opinions have changed pretty greatly about Nintendo, especially in the past 5 years since they released the Switch. And it's mainly because of some of the anti-consumer things that they've done. And I know that's a buzzword for people, anti-consumer. But it's interesting because things like their retro games, like a huge thing that's made me excited for the Steam Deck is the fact that Nintendo just announced that they're going to shut down the Wii U and the 3DS eShops. Like, parts of it are shutting down in less than 4 months. Like, you can't take more money or put more money into it in a couple months, and then it'll still be up, but there's functionality you won't have, and then in a year it's going to be gone. And so the Wii U and the 3DS are the last consoles to have the Virtual Console, which is pretty important to people because right now the Switch doesn't have a way to just buy games. And then there's a whole discussion about like buying your games on the Switch doesn't guarantee you'll have them later because who knows how long the servers are going to be up to download those games again.
Right. And we're talking about a company that had their support call number on the Super Nintendo up for at least 25 years.
Yeah.
That they supported that. And so I don't know, it's not unsurprising for a company to take off support for old products. I would have expected Nintendo to last a lot longer than most companies, but they just seem to be.
Well, and if we compare, I want to bring this back to the Steam Deck in a little bit, but if we compare to the PlayStation 3, a little while ago, Sony was like, hey guys, we are going to shut down the Vita store and the PS3 store because they're like 15 years old at this point. Or the Vita's, I think the Vita came out in 2012, so it's like a decade now. But if we compare that to the Wii U, when did the Wii U come out?
Ooh. 2012.
2012, I think, which it's a decade, same as the Vita, but it's a mainline Nintendo console. It was the Nintendo console. It wasn't the side handheld. And the 3DS is another discussion because that is a handheld, but it did better than the Wii U.
And it also wasn't like GameCube sales levels. It was like, it sold like crazy.
The 3DS, yeah. Or what are you talking about?
I was talking about the Wii, but the 3DS too.
The Wii, yeah. But the PlayStation 3 with Sony, they announced that they were going to shut down, and everybody on the internet just exploded, and we're like, why are you doing this? You can't do this. And what is it? Is it Phil? No, Phil Spencer's Xbox. Who's the guy at PlayStation? Anyway, Sony and PlayStation came out and were like, okay, we've heard your input. We are going to keep those stores open. And what's funny is the PlayStation 3 store is much older than the Wii U one.
Right.
And I know the Wii U did horrible, so there's a little bit less of an argument there. But the 3DS is also much newer and did way better than the Wii U. And they're just shutting her down. And this isn't even talking about Xbox, who has had the same online architecture since the first Xbox. And you can still access your digital purchases from Xbox 360 on your Xbox Series X.
Yeah.
As long as they're backwards compatible. So,
I mean, ideally, Nintendo should have said, hey, let's move those games. It might be hard on the 3DS because I don't know what they had DS games on their virtual store at all, or what did they have?
They had DSiWare. That's the oldest.
They had the DSiWare, which might be hard to port to the Switch, but any like Wii emulators, they should have just put them in on the Switch and said, you have access to the ones you've already paid for on the Wii.
Yeah. And that's another discussion, because when they switched from Wii to Wii U, you had to pay less of a fee, but you still had to pay a fee if you wanted those virtual console games for the Wii U. You could still access them in Wii mode, but then you had to go to Wii mode every single time you wanted to play those retro games. So if you wanted to play them on the Wii U, you had to pay a little fee to get them upgraded, and you're still getting the exact same game.
What's funny is most complaints
that you already had.
Most complaints aren't even about the fact that you can't get your Wii purchased games on the Switch. It's that they don't even allow you to rebuy them on the Switch. But
yeah,
I mean, we're delving into Nintendo hate here, but
yeah, we got a lot of.
Essentially, I mean the Steam Deck basically is the
polar opposite.
Well, I was gonna say it's the biggest competition to enter the modern console war in I don't know how long, in a long time.
So what I see Valve doing is, first off, like we talked about already, they're trying to make PC gaming as console player friendly as possible. They want it to be as close, but what comes with that is the Steam store has been up nearly 20 years now.
Right.
And we've got just about that entire catalog that we can still access on the Steam Deck, given that the Proton compatibility layer can support those games. But the point is, no matter how many Steam Decks are made in the future, you're still going to have all those games you bought on the very first Steam Deck, as opposed to Nintendo or PlayStation, and in some cases Xbox, not all of them. And I think that's a really cool thing about the Steam Deck, because that's never going to change. As long as Steam servers are going still, as long as Valve's in business, it's not going to change.
Computer architecture does not significantly change.
I mean, it's been the same for 25 years.
Like, in Xbox, they sort of had computer architecture to begin with, and their architecture has not been crazy.
Well, the interesting thing is the more time progresses, the closer and closer those consoles actually get to that. Because now they're just straight up on x86 architecture, which is what all of our PC computers run on most of the time.
Which is why you see way more ports, I think, to
And
PC.
Funny thing, the Switch is still on ARM. So there's a little bit less.
It's easier to port to than Nintendo's
Power
PC processors,
which they used on the GameCube and the Wii and the Wii U.
Which they should have dumped at the Wii. They should have had the Wii something else.
Yeah.
So that they could have good ports. But at least they have the ARM. At least they have better ports. But if they went to x86, I think it'd be even better. But the Steam's or Valve's goal of, I think, like making the PC market more console friendly is what they wanted to do, I think, with the Steam box. But they had the issue of compatibility. But I think the other issue was that most people were like, okay, if I'm going to have a console at home that's just a PC, why don't I just actually have a PC?
Yeah.
So I think their chance of entering that market is substantially better with a handheld option, because the competition for handheld PCs is not difficult.
As someone who has daily driven one of these handheld gaming PCs, there's a lot of jank. They are extremely, extremely janky and difficult, and not very beginner friendly or even experienced friendly. So I think Valve comes ahead really far with the Steam Deck because of how user friendly the interface is at the beginning. You find a game on the store that says it's great for the Steam Deck, you hit install or buy and then hit install, and it just opens and works. Whereas on here, you're like, did I get the right drivers? Are they updated? Oh, I updated too far? The game doesn't work anymore? Gotta roll back now.
Right. And they streamlined things that you might not even think about as much. Just like having an SD card, or that you can have your games on and they pop up automatically. Then you pull it out, put in a different SD card, and the games pop up. And you can easily choose, hey, I want this game on the SD card, or I want it on the PC itself, hard drive.
The closest way you can think about this is like not even the Switch can hot swap SD cards. It'll throw a freaking fit if you take out the SD card while it's running. It's like, I gotta shut down. But the closest thing is the game cartridges. When you pop in a game cartridge, that game pops to the front of the UI and you can just click play. That's what swapping SD cards is like on the Steam Deck.
But managing it is kind of like old memory cards, like on your PlayStation, where you can say, I want this save data moved to the memory card or to the console.
Yeah, it's very nice.
They might not have had a console, but from one memory card to the second memory card or something like that.
Yeah, then you pop it in a new console. Or you can copy. I don't know if you can copy games, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you could.
Probably not a need to.
Yeah.
You could just install it again, assuming your internet's okay. It wouldn't be so bad, but yeah, they've streamlined a lot of things to make it super user friendly, and that's the thing is when they're passionate, like you said, they seem to care more about the product and how it helps consumers than the money, which is kind of fills in contrast to Nintendo, who, after several years of everyone saying, hey, we just want a Switch that we can pay more money for, but actually get 60 frames per second on our games, or 30 frames per second on our games.
Yeah,
or
reals.
a 1080p screen, because our phones have had them for 15 years or whatever it's been, 10 years or what.
When,
Like,
yeah,
and what Nintendo does is they're like, here's a bigger screen.
yeah,
Yeah,
for $50 more. So it's interesting to talk about because Nintendo is pretty notorious. If you listen to any gaming podcast or anything like that, Nintendo's like the only company that still aims to make a profit from their hardware. Every other company is ready to take that loss because they know they'll make it back in the game store. And that's what Steam is doing here with the Steam Deck. Because the base Steam Deck is only $400. It's only $50 more than the OLED Switch. And you've got a 20-year backlog of Steam games that you could access in one way or another.
Now, they have some advantages. They are making bank off of Steam itself. I mean, they charge a ridiculous amount, or they take a ridiculous percentage, in my opinion, of every game that's bought.
Yeah, it's 30%. It's the same as Xbox and PlayStation. It is.
Is it the same as them?
Yep.
Well,
That's
then
standard.
Maybe it's not ridiculous. It felt
But,
ridiculous to me.
I don't know. Epic's kind of the one who drug up that conversation, and I don't know
They're trying
why.
to change the
I
market.
still don't see the Epic Store as a viable competitor to Steam still. I still think they're garbage. The only thing I have on there are free games except for the Scott Pilgrim game. Because that's the only place I could buy it. And that's kind of their goal, is to make it the only place. But I haven't heard as many
That's what you
exclusives.
have to do. When you don't make the product good enough, you have to resort to making it exclusive.
Paying out a ton of cash. I still don't know if the Epic Game Store is netting them a profit. I haven't heard anything about it. But they're still running, and I'm sure Fortnite's funding that whole thing.
Probably.
Goodness.
But so they have an advantage where, I mean, it's almost a different market than Nintendo has to deal with. Nintendo's has to deal with like we come out with a console and we have to make money off that single console, whereas Steam is like 20 years worth of games, and
they're pulling in money from...
And all they have to do is manage software to get that money.
I mean, they're still pulling... For any games on Steam that have in-game purchases, they're still pulling money from that too. They get the 30%. I think it's 30% for those as well. But like when I bought... Ben had given me a little bit of money to buy an animal on Sea of Thieves. And when I got that, it was through the Steam store. I was kind of surprised because it's an Xbox game. It's a Rare. It's developed by Rare, so Xbox owns it. And they still went through the Steam store. So I was like, oh,
I mean,
okay.
Maybe we're looking at it wrong. Maybe I don't know their motivation for the product, because if they're not making money off the product itself, you could kind of say, okay, then why do they need it at all? They already have a complete monopoly on the computer game market. But maybe they're worried that because consoles are so powerful now, and coming out with the abilities of computers, like 10 years ago, if I built a computer, it was going to play better than consoles.
Well, I think
for the most part. I mean, I paid
PC
more.
gaming is so complicated because I'm pretty sure a lot of the high hardware out there, pretty sure you don't need it to even match up with consoles, though. I mean, there's architecture bonuses like having ray tracing and stuff, but there's a couple points to that. Like, one was talking about how the Steam Deck could be like a honing in on what developers should shoot for when they're porting a game to PC. Because, like, there's not a goal. Like, with the Switch, it's like, okay, we need to get the game down to this level in order for it to run on here, and that's how we'll make it work. For PC, it's kind of like open. Like, I don't know, just slap it on Windows and make it run. And then PC gamers kind of have to scramble with settings and shiz to try and make the game work. Right. So that's one way of looking at that, but I forgot the other thing I was going to say.
I mean, maybe they're losing market share in the gaming world, and they're saying, okay, how can we revitalize PC game purchases in the world of console and mobile gaming?
Yeah. One theory that I have and a lot of other people have too is that they're just really trying to get away from Microsoft. Because as open as Microsoft has been with Xbox, Windows is also becoming a more closed platform. Microsoft has tried several times to make Windows a more closed down platform. They've tried with, I don't remember the actual names, but like Windows 10 Lite or whatever it was, where it's like you only get the Microsoft Store, and Xbox Game Pass games being updated through the Microsoft Store as well. Like they're really I think the Xbox Store is a pretty big threat for Steam, just because it's so integrated with Windows.
Well, and that's what Microsoft has been trying to do, because they're essentially like, hey, we have, like, aside from Mac, pretty much a monopoly on operating systems for computers. Like, pretty much everyone in the world has Windows. So, like, how can we take that to our advantage and make some more money off of it? Mm-hmm. Especially in a world where buying operating systems is becoming less, I guess, thought about for people. Like,
yeah, I think it would be really cool if Valve was able to strike a deal with some of these other handheld, like GPD, who have been very openly against Steam Deck. They love to bash the thing online. It's kind of funny to see because I think the Steam Deck is far superior. But it would be cool if Valve were to strike a deal with these people and be like, hey, you can make your device, and instead of paying for those Windows licenses, why don't you take the SteamOS for free, and then your device is easier to use anyways.
Right.
I think that would be a cool way for Valve to combat against Windows having such a massive market share.
Well, Valve probably already has the thing out there for free.
SteamOS 3 isn't out yet. You can get it specifically for the Steam Deck and try and apply it to other devices, but
right.
SteamOS 2 is still out there, but it's still running off of it's a different architecture. It's not Arch Linux, it's a different Linux.
Well, is their SteamOS stuff open source, like all of their other? So essentially, like,
there's an open source version of SteamOS called Chimera or something like that, and that's been updated by fans for
honestly,
a while.
If GPD-Win was smart, they wouldn't sit there and say, oh, you suck because you're going to do better than me. They could say, here's an open source software that has made our entire market way, way better. Let's try and implement it into our systems and say, hey, there's a lot of people that look at the store and say, I can't get one of these for over a year. Maybe I'll buy a GPD-Win because it's running the new SteamOS. Or
I think it would.
Or in a year's time, they could have some decent competition.
Yeah. There are companies like Aya who make some pretty good handhelds, pretty powerful, who they have developed their own software to be kind of a front end on top of Windows. And it's not perfect because you put up the thing, you're still met with Windows setup.
Well, and I think, I don't think I completed my thought earlier when I said that Steam pretty much had no choice but to use Linux. And what I was going into is that it's because Windows is bloated.
Oh, yeah.
It's bloated, is super bloated.
That's another massive
And so, like, trying to run, like, just trying to make an affordable product with minimal specs that's powerful enough to run high-level games and all of a sudden Windows is in the background doing nothing but eating up half the resources and just being a bloated mess, is why you pretty much have no choice but to go to Linux. So those companies that are doing Windows, that's what they have to deal with. That's what the GPD Win has to deal with.
Yeah, and frick. And like I had this a couple days ago, I had Linux running on here. And I mean, this is points against Linux and for Linux, but Sea of Thieves runs way better on here than with Linux than it does with Windows. Way better. At 60 frames per second most of the time at the same settings I had on Windows. On Windows, I have to limit to 30 frames per second because I feel like I'm going to throw up with the fluctuations all the time. And even then, sometimes I'll go to an island and the frame rate's just chugging on Windows. And I'm like, So that's a big point. And same with Halo. Halo, what's the map with the beach?
Which one?
High Ground. High Ground lags for me on here because there's so many people, and when I look down towards the beach, it starts to lag. Same with the pit. And on Linux, it doesn't do that as much because there's not as much shiz happening in the background. The device can devote more to the game.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it would benefit those other companies if they were to implement SteamOS because their
they
games
can take Proton and use it for themselves, which if it's open source, they can. Like, that's Valve's biggest gold star, is their open source nature.
Valve doesn't need to have the best device on the market. They need... It's like how Surface is for the laptop industry. Microsoft Surface, they release features in Windows, and then they release a device, and they're like, here's how we're using this device. Here's how we built this device. Everyone else should do this. And then the other companies kind of follow suit with like Windows Hello features where you can log in quickly and all that kind of stuff. I feel like this could be kind of what Steam Deck is for the handheld PC gaming
right
market.
I mean, maybe they just, I mean, like Microsoft, they didn't have to release a Surface, but maybe they decided they had to because no one was doing it right. And so in order to say, hey, okay, here's how you got to do it and implement good features like this, and maybe even for them to say, oh, here's how we should make the software work better for tablets so that they can penetrate the tablet market. And maybe like Steam's looking at the same thing, like, okay, how can we revitalize a portable PC market and also make sure that our software is like really good for it.
Something that just popped into my mind is in the past, like Gabe Newell I'm pretty sure he's been pretty open about how much him and the company of Valve look up to Nintendo in the aspect that Nintendo can come up with an idea and be like, hey, it'd be cool if we had a remote with motion controls in it and people could just play tennis with it. So then they have the power to make a console that has motion controls in their controller, and they can bring those ideas between hardware and their software games together. And I know that Valve has been very jealous of that ability that Nintendo has. So I don't know how true that jealousy or vision holds up today, but Valve has kind of always had like an eye towards Nintendo to be like...
when Nintendo comes out with something like that, they don't just say, here's some cool motion control in our new console. They say, here's some motion control in our new console, and here's like 30 little example games of how you could take advantage of that.
I mean,
Valve, how creative you can be with this. Because otherwise consoles games are going to do stupid things like when you shake it, it does one little thing. Like they wouldn't take quite as advantage of the features of things like that if Nintendo wasn't there to also say, here's how creative you can be with these ideas.
Yeah, Valve has done exactly that. I just realized with they just released a new free Portal game, and it's what is it? Aperture Desk Job, I think is what it's called. And it utilizes the Steam Deck controls in a way that's like, here's how this stuff all works. Here's Steam input. Kind of get used to it, how it works, and then you can apply this to other games. Or, hey, developers, you could apply this to your games because
like, here's our controller. It's got these pads that you may not be used to, but they've got advantages that you can take advantage of, but developers may not think like how they could take advantage of it without a good example of what they can do to take advantage of these types of controls, rather than just program left, right, up, down, whatever crap.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for Steam input, and I think every developer should utilize the API. That API's been around forever, by the way, and there are not many games that use it directly. And this is another subject, but like, you've got Left 4 Dead 2. You can have input on the joystick, and you can look around like a mouse with the pad on this side. So you're moving around with the full 360 degrees of the joystick and the sensitivity of it. You can walk slowly or you can speed up, and you can use the mouse at the same time. Whereas most other games that are just made for Windows, it's either the controller or the mouse and keyboard. If you try to use the same at the same time, it gets all confused, and that's where the Steam API comes in, because you can have those different types of inputs at the same time without the game freaking out and trying to show you different controls. Like, instead of press F to get in the car on GTA, it'll say like X depending on what you did last. If you looked over with the mouse last, then it'll be like press F to get in the car when you're mostly on a controller except for the one touchpad to look around. So, stuff like that. We've gone through everything on my notes, basically. One thing I had down here, kind of like a question I saw on Reddit, somebody was like, Valve should promote SteamOS 3 heavily as a desktop OS. And I thought, they probably shouldn't.
No.
Because we've already got that. It's called Windows. And I don't know what the benefit would be of putting SteamOS on a desktop computer.
The problem is their focus is gaming, and I mean, it doesn't matter how much you love Linux. If you're using your computer for most things, like any sort of work, you're going to have a hard time finding compatibility in Linux. I used 12 different pieces of software at work, and maybe one of them is Linux compatible.
Yeah, that's not to say, like, there are options for Linux, but it's like, I mean, I bring this up like, oh, you need to do word processing? Get OpenOffice. Except, like, it's always a lesser.
But in the real world, like, you share a document at work that's not DocX compatible and has all the same features, or doesn't load right in their
That's the thing.
It's like,
you can always save in those formats. Whether they pull up on the actual program correctly or not is another story.
Right. And when somebody sends you a Microsoft document with these advanced features in it, it's not going to pull up right in yours.
I think Linux works really well as a gaming platform. There's not a lot of those problems that can occur so long as a game just runs.
Now, if they play their cards right, they can, and you already said this is what they're going to do. They're basically going to replace Big Picture mode with SteamOS. That's the correct path. Leave it on top of Windows. Just replace like Big Picture mode.
Big Picture mode, I hate.
I don't think
hate it
anybody
so much.
who's playing on a desktop computer really wants to be in handheld console mode if they're sitting there with a mouse and a keyboard. They don't want to be, like, they'd probably rather just stick with the original Steam. Maybe they could implement some features, some quick menu features that do some cool stuff.
Yeah. The thing that we've talked about already too is if you have a really powerful gaming PC, the annoying bloat of Windows isn't as big of a deal
Right.
as if you're making a handheld PC like these, the GPD or Aya Neo, where that tiny bit of leeway can make a huge difference
In cost and performance.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on a desktop, not so much a problem.
Yeah.
Really. And so there's really no need. And yeah. And maybe if you don't work on your computer, you'd be okay with it running only SteamOS. I don't know. But
Yeah. Otherwise, dual boot.
you could dual boot.
But that's for enthusiasts.
But I think that Steam went the right route by saying, hey, we're going to take this UI, replace it big picture mode with it. That way, if you are using a computer with a controller hooked to a TV as a gaming console, you have that option. But like the market for that specifically is so small that like there's no need to be like trying to convince people to replace their entire OS with it.
Yeah.
Just give us the option to have it as the UI.
And I mean, there's already hacky workarounds to get it working. Like I showed you earlier today, I have the Steam Deck UI able to load up on my Windows laptop here, and it's functional in ways and not in others. But I mean, it just takes a tiny bit of work to. I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to frame this wrong for the developers who are trying to get this stuff ready.
Undervalue the work they have to put into it.
I mean, it's not just a tiny bit of work, but it's not like doing something completely from scratch. Like it's already we already have it running. They
designed it in a way
yeah.
that it can run. Like it's not exclusively needs to be totally rewritten for Windows.
Yeah.
They can port it over. Hopefully it's not too bad where they have to be maintaining tons of different code bases. But
I heard their goal, as opposed to Big Picture, was to keep Steam Desktop and Steam Deck UI more one-to-one than Big Picture was. Big Picture was completely different. So, like, I heard a quote from one of the developers that was like, if we update something on the desktop UI, it's just it's going to translate over and it won't be as big of a deal. So I know that was a goal that they had going into it, but
and that's the kind of thing you want to see. Like
when
I worked for a software company, we had a web interface and a desktop Windows interface. And the web guys were rebuilding from scratch a new interface, and every time they added a new like super cool feature, the desktop guys were like, why didn't you tell us about that? Like, we should be implementing these cool new features into the desktop version too.
And that's where making a progressive web app can really work in your benefit. Come on, guys. Developers, Facebook, YouTube, come on. I want that. Anyways, that's a different subject. I'm pretty sure that's what Steam is running, is a progressive web app for that UI.
But that sort of correspondence, like I'm sure they probably, and maybe they don't, but I would imagine they have a different team on each piece of software, the regular UI and the thing. But as if they're working in tandem enough to keep features,
it'd be nice
together.
Because I mean, aside from one update, Big Picture really hasn't changed in the many years that it's been around now. And it'd be nice if later on, if the Steam Deck was kind of depreciated, if they updated something on Steam, if it kind of came over still, that'd be really good to see. So that's nice. It's kind of future-proofing as well. If the whole Steam Deck thing doesn't entirely work out, then, you know, we're not left in the dust. So
Right, that's the other thing, is if they're using it for big picture mode and they see it as software that they're gonna maintain, even if they don't care to maintain the Steam Deck itself.
Yeah.
Then those of us with a Steam Deck are still supported.
Yeah.
As far as UI features and updates.
And that kind of goes with the general idea of the whole thing, where your library is still compatible over time, the UI hopefully is over time, and so lots of future proofing. But is there anything else we wanted to talk about? Like, I know there's a lot of features. There's like upscaling for things, but if we wanted to, we could do another episode later talking about more specifics. But
yeah, that's all I had, I think.
Cool. I think as a conclusion, we are very excited for the Steam Deck. I'm way more excited than everybody else I personally know around me, because I tend to hone in on this kind of thing. That's what I did with the GPD Win Max when I was getting it. And I've had it for almost 2 years now, I think. It's kind of crazy, but
it'll be a new world for someone like me who prefers to game with a mouse. But I think that Steam's controller pad is the closest thing I've ever had to feeling like, hey, I might actually be able to be good at playing on a controller.
Yeah, it's I just like how encompassing the controller design is for PC gaming, and there's not a lot of games that you just won't be able to play using that control set, so it's kind of nice. I'm very excited. I'm excited about the specs of it. I'm excited about the software of it. I'm excited about just having a computer that's powerful enough.
And knowing that its lifespan is going to be probably longer than most things. Like, I don't know, 10 years from now, a game comes out, maybe it won't play on it, but maybe you can turn everything down all the way and still play on it.
Yeah, it'll be super nice to have that backwards compatibility. So anyways, if you've made it this far, be sure to let us know what you think. You can find me on Twitter if you desire to go to Twitter. I believe it's at MRMCAYYY, so at Mr. McKay with no spaces. So yeah. Otherwise, we'll catch you in 2 more years when we do another episode. Thanks for watching.